All right, so today we're getting into something pretty fundamental. When we think about all these clinical trials happening for new drugs and medical devices, how can we be sure they're actually being done right? I mean, safely and producing results we can actually trust. That's what we're diving into today, the whole world of compliance and enforcement and these really crucial audit mechanisms. All the stuff that underpins the FDA's good clinical practice regulations, or GCT as everyone calls it.
Yeah, it's kind of like looking under the hood, right? Like understanding the
Yeah.
nuts and bolts of how we get these new treatments and make sure they're actually safe and effective before they're available to patients. This is something that really matters for everyone, really, even if you're not directly involved in clinical research.
Absolutely. Whether you're a researcher, a healthcare provider, or just someone who relies on medications, understanding this whole oversight process gives you a better sense of how we can be confident in those medical treatments. So our mission today is to dig deep into how these trials are actually overseen and what happens when things go wrong, when those standards aren't met. We're going to pull from regulatory documents and expert insights to try to give you the clearest picture possible.
Okay, so, when we're talking about oversight, one of the first things that comes to mind is the FDA's Bioresearch Monitoring Program, BIMO.
BIMO, right?
This program is really the cornerstone of the FDA's effort to monitor all these clinical trials that are going on. We're talking about inspections of actual trial sites and in-depth audits of all the data that's collected. And the scale of this program is huge. Think over 1,500 inspections every single year, both here in the U.S. and internationally.
Wow, 1,500 inspections a year. That's a lot. So who exactly is responsible for managing this whole program?
Right, so within the FDA, the Office of Scientific Investigations, or OSI, that's who coordinates BIMO. They've got a very specific structure in place to make sure that GCP compliance is happening across the board.
So we've been using the term inspections. Can you break down what an inspection actually looks like? What are they focusing on when they go into a trial site?
Sure. So you've got your GCP inspections. These are a big focus, especially those tied to NDAs and BLAs. Those are the applications you need to get a new drug approved. But the BIMO program is pretty wide-ranging. It also includes inspections for good laboratory practice, or GLP. That covers the non-clinical lab studies that need to be done before you even start testing on humans. And then there are inspections for bioavailability, bioequivalent studies, institutional review board, or IRB inspections, which look at the ethics boards that oversee trials, and even inspections related to paid clinical investigators and RMS, which are safety plans for specific medications.
So it sounds like a really comprehensive system covering all the crucial steps in drug development. But going back to OSI, you mentioned this structure dedicated to GCP compliance. Can you unpack that a bit more?
Yeah, so within OSI, you've got the Division of Enforcement and Post-Marketing Safety. This division handles issues that arise after a product is already on the market. Then there's the Division of Clinical Compliance Evaluation, which is all about the actual clinical trials. And under that, you've got branches like the GCP Compliance Oversight Branch, which deals with complaints and IRB surveillance, and the GCP Assessment Branch. They're really focused on the inspections that happen as part of the NDA and BLA review process.
So that GCP assessment branch is really on the front lines when it comes to making sure the data supporting those drug approvals is solid. Now, let's talk about GCP itself for a minute. We keep using the term, but what exactly does good clinical practice involve?
GCP is essentially a set of international standards that ensure the quality and reliability of clinical trial data, while also protecting the rights and well-being of the people who volunteer for those trials. It dictates how trials should be planned, conducted, recorded, overseen, analyzed, and reported, all of it. These are the gold standard principles in the draft ICH E6R3 guideline.
Okay, that makes sense. So if the FDA decides to inspect a trial site to see if those GCP standards are being met, what triggers that inspection? It can't be every single trial, right?
Right, there are specific triggers. A major one is when a company submits an NDA or BLA for a new drug. They want to independently verify the data in that application, make sure it's solid. Other triggers might include complaints about a trial site or even information that comes up during routine IRB surveillance.
So it's a mix of routine checks and reacting to potential issues. Now, I've heard the term risk-based inspections. What does that mean in the context of GCP? How does the FDA decide what to focus on?
That's a great question. So with risk-based inspections, the FDA doesn't examine everything with the same level of detail. Instead, they prioritize what are called critical to quality factors. These are things that are absolutely essential for protecting the participants in the trial and ensuring the data is reliable. It's all about focusing on the areas where problems would have the biggest impact. This approach is also a key part of ICH-Q9, the Guideline on Quality Risk Management.
So what kind of things would fall under that critical to quality umbrella? What are some examples?
Sure. We're talking about things like the key data points in the study, the primary endpoints, for example. We're also talking about the core elements of the study's design that make it scientifically valid. And of course, we're talking about really important study processes and procedures, how informed consent is obtained, how the investigational product is handled and administered, those kinds of things. For example, in a trial for a new diabetes drug, getting accurate blood glucose measurements would be a critical data point. If those measurements are off, it could throw off the whole study. Sponsors and investigators need to do their own risk assessments to figure out what those critical factors are.
So it's not about looking at every single detail, but rather zeroing in on the areas that really matter the most. Okay, so let's say an inspection is actually triggered. What happens when the FDA shows up at a clinical trial site? What's that process look like?
Well, typically the FDA will notify the sponsor of the study that a clinical investigator or CI inspection is going to happen at a specific site. Interestingly, the FDA doesn't have a set rule about whether the sponsor can be there during the inspection. Usually that's up to the sponsor and the investigator to work out.
Interesting. So the FDA arrives at the site. What are the next steps?
They'll usually have an opening meeting with the investigator and the site staff. They'll lay out the scope of the inspection, what they'll be looking at. And then the inspection itself might take several days. Often they'll have daily closing discussions, kind of updating the investigator on what they found so far, any immediate questions they have. And finally, there's a closeout meeting.
Okay, and at that closeout meeting, do the investigators share their initial findings or concerns?
Yeah, if they see any potential violations, they might issue what's called a Form FDA 483, or inspectional observations. This is a written list of the specific things they found that don't seem to be in line with the regulations. But it's important to remember that this form is just a factual record. It doesn't tell the investigator how to fix things. It just flags the issues.
So the investigator gets this list of observations. Then what? Are they just expected to fix the problems?
Exactly. The investigator or the trial site has 15 business days to send a written response to the FDA. And this response is super important. It's a chance to address each observation on the 483, say whether they agree or disagree, and most importantly, explain how they're going to fix things.
So it's more than just saying, we'll take care of it. What should be included in a strong response?
For each observation, they need to lay out a corrective and preventive action plan, a CAPA plan. This outlines how they'll correct the specific issue and, crucially, how they'll prevent it from happening again.
We've talked about CAPA before. Can you remind our listeners what a good CAPA plan looks like?
Sure. A good CAPA plan will be very detailed. It'll say what's already been done to correct the issue, when it was done, and what's still planned. It will include timelines for completing those actions and how they'll check to make sure the problem's really fixed. It's about both fixing the immediate problem and making sure it doesn't come back.
Okay, so it's like putting out a fire and then installing a smoke detector. What else makes a good 483 response?
Supporting documentation can really help. Things like updated training records for staff, revised standard operating procedures, SOPs, maybe even evidence that contradicts the FDA's observation if the investigator disagrees with it. And if there are similar observations, they can be grouped together with one overall KP plan. It also helps to have a statement from leadership showing they're taking it seriously. A really well-organized, easy to understand, and comprehensive response is key, especially if it's submitted on time.
Got it. A good response is all about being thorough and timely. So what happens to that response once it's sent to the FDA? What do they do with it?
The FDA investigator will take the 483, if there was one, along with the site's response and any other documents. And they'll use all of that to write up a big report called an Establishment Inspection Report, or ER. This EIR then gets sent to the relevant FDA center for their review.
And what does that review tell us? What's the outcome?
The FDA wants to give an official classification within 90 days of the inspection. Usually there are 3 classifications: no action indicated, NAI, meaning everything looks good; voluntary action indicated, VAI, which means there were some minor issues that the site should voluntarily fix; and official action indicated, OAI, which means more serious problems were found and some kind of regulatory action is probably needed. If it's NAI or VAI, the company will usually get a letter from the FDA and maybe a redacted copy of the EIR, but these reports aren't usually made public.
So the company sees the report, but not the public. What if the company doesn't get an EIR within 90 days?
In that case, they should reach out to the contact person on the 483 or to the investigator to ask for a status update.
Okay. So let's say the FDA finds serious issues, leading to that OAI classification. We've talked about the 483 and the EIR, but what are the real consequences of noncompliance? What can happen?
The 483 is really just the first step. If the response isn't good enough, or if the violations are really bad, the FDA might issue a warning letter. And even if the response is late, they'll still look at it, although it might not be mentioned in the warning letter. This warning letter means the FDA is serious and the company needs to address those issues right away.
What kind of impact can a warning letter have? What happens if they ignore it?
A warning letter is a big deal. If a company doesn't respond properly, they could face even more serious actions from the FDA. One consequence is that data from the trial could be rejected. So if they're trying to get a drug approved and the FDA doesn't trust the data because of GCP violations, that drug might not get approved. We saw this in an OSI workshop case study where problems with documentation and informed consent raised serious concerns about the entire study's data.
Wow, so it can actually prevent a new drug from coming to market. What are some of the other broader impacts of noncompliance? What are the bigger picture consequences?
Well, noncompliance can put public health at risk. We could see things like substandard medical products hitting the market, leading to people getting sick. It could contribute to drug shortages if manufacturing has to stop due to compliance issues. And of course, it can damage public trust in the whole system.
And those impacts go beyond just the trial sites and the drug companies, right? What about all the other players involved in drug development and manufacturing?
Right. Think about contract development and manufacturing organizations or CDMOs. For them, a bad track record with compliance can be really damaging. They could lose contracts and their operations could be disrupted. And then you have the labs that do the non-clinical safety studies under GLP regulations. If they have serious violations, they could be disqualified. And that means the data they produced might not be considered acceptable, which could delay or even prevent a drug from being approved.
So non-compliance can really have a ripple effect across the entire industry. And ultimately, patients might not get the treatments they need. It could even lead to drugs being pulled off the market if there are safety concerns.
Exactly. And we have seen drugs being withdrawn, as outlined in regulations like 21 CFR Parts 216 and 330, because of problems that often stem from issues during the development or manufacturing process. This really highlights why sticking to these GCP and CGMP regulations is so important.
Right, following those regulations is crucial. So we've talked about how the FDA enforces compliance, but what about the companies themselves? What are they doing proactively to make sure they're meeting those standards?
The CGMP, or Current Good Manufacturing Practice regulations, are a big part of it. They really stress the importance of strong quality systems and controls. That's spelled out in several parts of the Code of Federal Regulations, like Parts 111 and 211, and in guidelines like ICH Q7. These systems are meant to build quality into every single step, not just test for it at the end.
And audits are a key part of any good quality system, right? We hear about internal audits, external audits, supplier audits. Can you explain the role those different types of audits play in maintaining GCP compliance?
Absolutely. Audits are like regular checkups for the quality system. Internal audits are done by the company itself to make sure things are running smoothly. External audits might be done by a third party or by the sponsor of a trial to check up on their partners, like contract research organizations, CROs, or the trial sites. And supplier audits focus on the quality of everything coming into the company, like raw materials, components, and any outsourced services. This is highlighted in the ICH Q11 Q&A guidance.
So they're all about catching problems early on. What does a typical audit process involve? What are the steps?
Well, whether it's internal, external, or a supplier audit, the process is pretty similar. It starts with planning, figuring out what the audit will cover, then they'll actually conduct the audit, looking at documents, observing processes, and interviewing people. All the findings are documented and then reported to the relevant folks. It's really about seeing if things are being done according to plan and if those plans are actually effective. The goal is to find any areas where things aren't quite right and could be improved.
And once they find those problems, it's not enough just to identify them. They need to be addressed. That's where the corrective and preventive action, or COLABI system, comes in, right?
You got it. COLABI is essential, both for audits and for inspections. When a problem is found, the company needs to figure out why it happened, fix it, and then prevent it from happening again. A strong COLABI system is really the foundation for continuous improvement.
And of course, we've talked a lot about the importance of documentation. How does good record keeping support all of this?
Documentation is everything. If it's not documented, it's like it never happened. Everything needs to be accurate, legible, contemporaneous, original, complete, consistent, enduring, and available. Those are the LLCOA Plus principles we've discussed before. Good documentation is required by regulations like 21 CFR Part 211 Subpart J. It's proof that procedures are being followed, and it's essential for internal audits, external audits, inspections, and KPA investigations.
Makes sense. And finally, we've touched on validation before. How does process validation tie into all of this?
Process validation ensures that manufacturing processes consistently produce high-quality products. This includes things like design qualification, DQ, installation qualification, IQ, operational qualification, OQ, and performance qualification, PQ. We've mentioned that framework before, and it's outlined in resources like the 21 CFR 111 YouTube video. It's all about proving that a specific process will reliably create a product that meets all the required standards. And it's not just about the initial validation. Continuous monitoring and reassessment, especially of those critical to quality factors, are essential throughout the entire process. That's something that's often discussed in FDA conferences.
So it's this constant cycle of regulations, industry efforts, audits, inspections, enforcement, and always striving to do things better. It's complex, but ultimately it's all about making sure those medical products are safe and effective.
Exactly. We have this whole system of checks and balances to make sure good clinical practice is being followed. Inspections, audits, KPA, it all works together to protect people participating in trials and ensure that the data we use to make decisions about new treatments is reliable.
It is a complex landscape, but incredibly important. And with clinical research becoming increasingly global, how do we strengthen international collaboration to make sure those standards are consistent all over the world? And what about the impact of new technologies? They offer great potential, but could also create new challenges for compliance.
Those are really important questions. As the world and technology continue to change, we need to adapt and make sure those basic principles of GCP and CGMP remain strong and effective in protecting public health.
It's definitely something to think about.
Absolutely. It's an evolving landscape, and we need to keep learning and adapting to ensure patient safety remains at the forefront.
Well said. And that's a wrap for our deep dive today.
Until next time.
See